welcome to another episode of Inside the Black Box. Today's Black Box is going to be something which most of you are very, very familiar with, and that is the good old Nintendo NES game cartridge. We talked about game cartridges from the early 80s, late 70s last time, so you kind of have an idea of what this technology looks like. Nintendo, as we will see, there is a theme with this company. They did things slightly differently, a little bit more complex, but actually adds a huge amount of value for them. And it's part of the reason that Nintendo games seem to be that far ahead of the competition at the time. So we're going to pop open a couple of these carts and see how they work. So this particular cart is a copy of Cybernoid. I've actually never played Cybernoid on the NES. I played it quite a bit on the Commodore 64. Great game. I picked this up at a Goodwill. It was nice and cheap, and then I discovered it was actually busted. So nothing I can do to get this guy running. So I thought, okay, at least we can sacrifice him to science and we can see what's going on. So as you will see, this is again a very large physical object, right? It's got a nice big heft to it. The reason this cartridge has the shape it has, interestingly, is tied to Nintendo's strategy for selling NES machines in the US. If you know the Japanese version of the NES, which is called the Famicom, you'll know that the cartridges are basically half the size, right? So why are the damn American cartridges so big? Is it because everything is bigger in America? Actually, no. So Nintendo had a very interesting problem to solve at the time. When Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan, and it did very, very well, right? Japan had not had the kind of Atari revolution. Nintendo was really the first company to strike it big with a video game console, or a home video game console. And so obviously at some point they looked and they said, okay, we are ready to translate this product to the US and make it big. And the original plan was for them to basically take the Famicom as was, right, the same shape and everything, and just kind of ship it to the US and just sell it. But at that time, Atari had triggered essentially the video game crash of the kind of early 80s. And that had kind of led consumers to consider video games as like a thing that happened for a couple of years, and you know, it was burned out and it was going to be a non-issue. So Nintendo was really afraid that they were going to bring the machine to the US, which would have involved a lot of work, right? You have to translate all the documentation into English. You have to go to the FCC, get all your products tested. They would have asked you to make changes, translate a bunch of games into English, perhaps write new games which are more appealing to an American audience. So there would have been a huge amount of work to take this machine to market in the US. You don't want to get there and then nobody wants to buy it because they think, oh, it's another crappy Atari. So what Nintendo's strategy to solve this problem was very clever. They said, okay, let's not make it look like a video game console. Let's make it look like something else. And then hopefully people want to buy it. So the NES machine itself was designed to look like a VCR, right? Like a video machine. And so instead of loading from the top the way that the Famicom did, it kind of loads from the front just like a video game, just like a video recorder. And in order to make that work, you had to have this big cartridge because of the kind of physical proportions of how everything worked, right? And you also didn't want to have your cartridges look anything like the Atari cartridges, because that would have just signaled to consumers like, oh yeah, this is, you know, it's like Atari, just as crappy, don't buy it. So they were extremely afraid of that. And that's actually another reason they released their Rob the Robot add-on for NES, because they were trying to sell the NES as like, it's not a video game console, it's a cool educational, scientific, electronic toy kind of thing. So kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting to imagine that there was a time when nobody wanted to buy video games, right? But anyway, that's what Nintendo was fighting against, and that's why they made this honkin' great cartridge. So you've probably seen this 1,000 times. It's not worth talking about the outside very much. It's got this nice little tab so you can kind of pull it out and in and out of the machine. It's closed by 3 security screws, which we'll look at in a second. It's got the same label on most of these. That number, by the way, 1985, refers to the design of the cartridge, not the game inside. So later games still had 85, and it's got Nintendo stamped over here. At the bottom you have got just the card edge connector exposed, no protection like the Atari cards had. Nintendo figured that the cost of doing that was not worth the benefit that you get back, and I think in some sense history has proven them to be right. Because the number one enemy of card edge connectors is not actually physical damage, it's actually oxidation, it's rust, right? And you can't make these things airtight, so they just decided let's not do it at all. By the time they came to the US, they'd already had a couple of years experience with Famicom cartridges, so they probably thought it was worth taking a gamble. Okay, so to open this thing, we can't use a regular screwdriver because, safety screw, oh no, we are blocked. You got to use the safety screw thing, which is actually just kind of a hex driver. I don't know if you can see this. It's kind of like a regular screwdriver, but it's got a kind of hexagonal head. So I'm going to pop this into my thing here. We'll take one off and I'll show you what that looks like. It's got 3. Nintendo in those days, and I think it's true even today, in fact probably for all their products, they really cared about the final quality of how things look, so everything's just built so nicely. This is not Jack Tramiel style stuff. So this is what one of these security screws looks like. It's got a tiny little kind of knurly head, and they pop open pretty easily once you get the screws out. Hopefully I won't have a repeat of the horrendous VIC-20 cartridge disaster of 2015. I was kind of stuck in there. Oh, there we go. There we go, nice and easy. It's got 2 clips on the side, and like I said, mostly open space, right? You have got the PC board at the bottom, which is the magical stuff, and then lots of space on top. Nintendo was still planning at the time that they might build game cartridges which used additional electronics, so this space was kind of reserved for that. Some games users, as we will see, will pop one open, but mostly not. So let me just lift this out. It's just kind of in place. There we go. And there it is. That is a Nintendo cartridge. Cybernoid is a fairly typical Nintendo cartridge. There's nothing kind of fancy about it. And so it'll give you a very good idea of what your average game looks like. So if you pop open a Super Mario 3, it'll look very much like this. So what we have then, which is interesting here, is we have 2 big chips, which are the main ROMs in which the program and data are stored. We have got another chip here, which has got, if you follow the plumbing, has got a lot of connections back to these 2. And then there's another chip here on the side which is not connected to these 2 at all. It just seems to disappear into the card edge. Like, what's going on? If it's not talking to these guys, what's it doing? We'll talk about that. And then the very interesting point is you've got the card edge connector at the bottom, and it's on both sides, as you would expect. But there's this giant gap in the middle, right? Let me hold it up here so you can see more clearly. See how there's a gap here with no pins? There is a good reason for that. If you open up a Famicom cartridge, it doesn't have this. In fact, the Famicom cartridge is kind of narrower because all the pins are next to each other without a gap. The reason the gap exists, some people said that the reason for that is because Nintendo didn't want you using Japanese cartridges in the American systems because it was a kind of region locking thing. Maybe, but that's not the technical reason this gap exists. The technical reason this gap exists is Nintendo had plans for enabling game designers to sell their games together with hardware peripherals, like additional hardware goodies. And if you take a NES machine and you flip it over, you'll notice it's got a spring-loaded trapdoor with another card edge connector. Now, if you follow that card edge connector's traces up, they would connect to these pins. So the idea is that we would give, or Nintendo would give, game developers a way of having their chips talk directly to that peripheral plug-in at the bottom of the machine. Now, nobody ever used that, right? It's kind of one of the unwritten rules of video console design, that if you require people to build additional hardware, they will never do it. And this lesson has been learned many, many times. The Nintendo NES Zapper gun, almost nobody used it. The Super Nintendo Bazooka light gun thing, nobody ever used it. The Kinect from Microsoft, nobody ever used it. The Sony Light Eye toy camera thing, hardly anybody used it. And this was really kind of the beginning of that, right? Let's design this awesome peripheral thing. Nobody ever used it. So let's talk about these chips for a second. What we have here, and let me just flip these around so you can read the codes. So what we have here are, these are the kind of main ROMs. Then we have this chip here, which is connected to them, and then we have this one which is disconnected from anything. So the main ROMs in a Nintendo cartridge, you will always find 2 of them. And if you read, you have to kind of flip it up and down. Above them it says U1 PRG, and then it says U2 CHR. So PRG stands for program and CHR stands for character. So what's happening is this chip is storing the program data. So the levels, the actual code, the sounds, while this stores just graphical data, right? So this one will say a thing like, for example, on a Mario level, it'll say, at this position on the screen, draw me the graphical tile for a mushroom. And this will actually have the graphical data, the shape of the mushroom stored in it, right? And the reason they did this in a separate way, as we will see, is because they want to enable as much content as possible in terms of graphics, which was the thing that everybody wanted. And so we do this in a separate chip. The program, etc., we keep in one place because generally speaking, in any computer application, you have a lot less code than you have data. Now, what this chip does is it lets you essentially have more content stored here on these chips, the CHR chips, than can fit into the Nintendo's memory. So in other words, you can have a game which just every level has new amazing graphics, which, you know, the Nintendo can only reference 64K of memory at a time because it's an 8-bit machine, right? We talked about bitness and address bus width and data bus width in the last episode. But you can store a game, you can have a game that has way more than 64K of content. How do you allow your computer to address more than 64K of content if the width of your address bus is only 64K? And the answer is this chip right here is what's called a memory controller, and it allows you to essentially switch out which bits of memory you want to have active at any time. So we'll go to the whiteboard and explain how these memory controllers work. So the other interesting piece of technology that's inside an NES cartridge is what we call bank switching. And this is the thing that lets you essentially have way more content in your cartridge than you can have inside the memory of the machine, right? So you remember from the last episode when we talked about how game cartridges work, that we talked about how you have the address bus, and the address bus limits the size of word, or the number of words that I can have reachable to the processor. And we said there's a limit of 256 of them, right? Because it's an 8-bit bus. What happens if I want more graphics than that? What happens if in level 1 I want to use 256 different tiles, but in level 2 I want a different set of 256 tiles, right? How do I deal with that? Well, if you played on old computers, like 8-bit computers like the Commodore 64, they had a very simple way of solving this problem, which is you would play a game, right? You would put in your disk into the disk drive, load the game, you'd play. At some point when you'd played through all the content, the game would simply say, okay, stick in disk number 2. And you'd remove the disk and put in disk number 2, and then you play that content, right? If you've played games like Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, that thing came on a lot of disks, right? There was way more content on those disks that could fit inside the PlayStation's memory, and the way the game developers solved that problem was to say, okay, when you're finished one set of content, pop in the next set of content. And so a single disk might store only, you know, whatever it is, some amount of words, and when we've used them all up, we just need to start again at 0, but have different content, which is what swapping a disk is. So what bank switching is doing exactly this idea of swapping disks, but doing it with memory chips, with ROM chips. So what you will have is, you might, for example, have 2 ROM chips inside your cartridge. Both of them can hold the maximum amount of memory that's addressable by the machine. And then you'll have another chip here, which Nintendo called the MMC, the memory controller. And so the game would simply say, okay, here is my address bus. I want address number 57, but I want it on bank 1. Right, so I wanted number 57 here on bank 1. So the MMC would say, okay, bank 1 is this chip, so return me number 57 from this chip. And then you would happily do that. When the computer wanted content from bank 2, you would just set this here, and then it would fetch it from this chip. And if you remember last time we talked about how the address was kind of like your telephone number. It's the unique number that lets you reach out to a particular place and read or write the content to it. Think of the bank as the kind of area code, right? Yeah, you've got a certain set of phone numbers here and a certain set of phone numbers here, and the numbers overlap, but they have their own area code, so we always get to the right person. So your bank number is kind of like the area code to the system, and that's how you can have way more content on a cartridge that actually fits in the memory at the same time. And almost every Nintendo game use some kind of MMC, and there were quite a few of them. As kind of technology improved, they added new kinds of MMCs, but essentially let them have way more content inside the cart than the machine could store. And really, the amount of banks that you had were limited kind of almost only by the budget of the game, right? So that's how NES games were able to give you such rich content for really kind of seeming to break through the boundaries that other 8-bit machines had. Okay, so that is how memory controllers and bank switching works, and how you can have more content on a cartridge that can be used by a machine whose address bus is not wide enough to deal with all that. It's really a very clever system. So this particular chip at the bottom is actually made by Philips, which is a Dutch electronics company, and the code on this one is 74HC161P. This chip is actually not a dedicated memory controller. It just gets used by the guys who wrote Cybernoid in this way. This chip actually is what's called a decade counter. It just counts from what you send a signal, and it has an internal memory that counts from 1 to 10. You send it, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and when it gets to 9, it flips back to 0. And they use that to do their own memory control. The thing about bank switching is the NES didn't really have an operating system that did this for you the way that, you know, any computer has, even old computers like the Commodore 64. So game developers were free to pick which chip they used for memory management, and they were then, when they wrote the code, they would just handle it. And Nintendo didn't really care what you did in that space. So that's how Nintendo was able to have these incredibly rich games with way more content than any of their competitors. It's a really clever system. But for that to work, of course, these chips that actually store the magic have to be affordable enough that designers can actually, you know, spend the money on a game to store that stuff. So that's still the cost of memory of the CMOS chips still kind of put a limit on the content available in games, and of course the physical space in the cart, right? You can only fit so many of these things in here, so that limits it. And the way that sort of problem was finally solved was when they moved to removable media, things like discs and CDs, etc. Because, you know, producing a CD is super cheap, and you can have Final Fantasy VII that came on whatever it was, 5 or 6 CDs, and have tons of content, and it was totally affordable. So now that explains what this guy is, but what about this mysterious chip on the side here, which actually is not really connected to any of the memories? It's kind of standing by itself. And if you look at it, I don't know if you can read the kind of serial number for it there. It's got the Nintendo trademark, so it's a custom Nintendo chip, and it's called a 6113B1. What the hell is that thing? Well, it turns out that this is a DRM chip. One of the problems that Nintendo feared, having learned from the Atari crash, was the reason the Atari managed to crash the video game market was anybody could write an Atari game. You just kind of got an Atari, you figured out how it worked, which was pretty simple, and you would just create your game, stick it in a box, and sell it. Atari had no say in whether a game was approved for release or not. Anybody could write for it. Atari's thinking was, in order for us to make this machine a success, we need lots of games. So make it open, let everybody write games for it. Seems reasonable. Unfortunately, what happened was the market started getting flooding with really awful games, just terrible games. The quality was really poor. They were not playable. Companies were just putting a game into any code into a cartridge in the hopes that they would sell. And so that was part of the problem with Atari VCS games, was these bad games, you know, for every Pitfall, which was, you know, this beautifully crafted, really well designed and well written game that pushed the machine to its absolute limits, for every one of those there would be like 100 just terrible games. And so the public got the perception that video games are these really low quality things. It's not worth paying the amount of money that these companies are asking. So Nintendo decided, we are not going to fall into that trap. We are going to require companies to show us their designs, and we will only approve the ones that we want to sell. So they were looking for a certain level of quality, and they were looking for things that might kind of scare off the public. So they were staying away from controversial topics. So, you know, on the Atari 2600, you had Custer's Stand. Well, Nintendo was not going to have a game that had anything to do with kind of controversial, you know, sex stuff, politics stuff, a lot of violence. They just want to steer clear of that stuff so they wouldn't offend anyone. So how do you prevent someone from making a cartridge for your machine, right? Essentially, what you need to do is you need to know that when this cartridge is inserted into your console, it is a trusted cartridge that you have approved. And this chip is what manages that. That is your digital rights management, your DRM module. It is what ensures that this cartridge has to have one of these chips which only Nintendo makes, and Nintendo will only give you this if they've approved your game. And so we need a mechanism that the NES can kind of sniff this cartridge and say, yeah, this has got a bona fide chip. I'm going to play this game. So how did they do that? Well, let's go back to the whiteboard and look at how this DRM chip works. Okay, so the problem that Nintendo was trying to solve with their DRM chip is this. How do I trust that this cartridge is one that we actually licensed? And the problem is basically the same problem that an ATM machine has when it wants to give you money. How do I know that this is the correct guy that I should give the money to? And you solve both problems in the same way. You need to essentially share a secret between both parties, right? The reason the ATM gives you money is because you arrive and say, hello, I'm Dave, this is my password, 1234. The ATM machine looks inside and says, okay, in my records, the guy Dave says should have a password of 1234. It matches, therefore I'm going to give him the money. For Nintendo, the problem is the same. We need to share a secret between the NES and the cartridge, and that will prove that the cartridge is a trusted one, right? So how do they actually do this in the Lockout chip? So what we have essentially is we have the NES on one side and we have the cartridge here. And in the middle is what we call the trust boundary, right? This is the line where, from the NES's point of view, what is outside here might not be trusted. Maybe it's trusted, maybe it isn't. We need to establish that, right? So in a kind of regular ATM password scenario, the NES will say, okay, dude, what's your password? And it'll send that to the card. And the card will say, hey, my password is 1234, and it'll send that back to the NES. Then the NES will compare. 1234 is what I'm expecting. Did I actually get that? Yes. Thumbs up. And then we start the game. No problem, right? This is pretty much what happens in an ATM. This is what happens when you log into a web page. This is kind of standard technology for passwords. However, it's got a flaw, right? And this is a well-known flaw. If you've ever gotten one of those emails from websites saying, oh, somebody hacked into our site and everybody has to reset their passwords, that's the problem. If the person who you are trying to protect from, so in other words, if your unlicensed, crappy cartridge maker guesses what this password is, then they can fake being a real cartridge, and then you will trust them even though they're not trustworthy. They have stolen your password, right? And this is what happened with HD DVD, and Blu-ray when the famous AACS key leaked, right? Somebody went into a DVD, I think it was a Blu-ray player, they hooked it up to a bunch of debuggers and other kind of security breaking software. They discovered what the key was, the password, and now they were able to, with an unlicensed DVD, Blu-ray player, play Blu-rays, right? So Nintendo kind of, even though they were doing this, almost 30 years ago, they kind of found an elegant way to solve the problem of the password being stolen. So what Nintendo did is, the chips don't actually store a password. They store an algorithm, in other words, a set of instructions that modifies data in a particular way, in a very complicated way, which is very difficult to guess, right? So the chip, and it's expecting to have the same chip on both sides, right? So this is the DRM Lockout chip. It's the exact same chip that's mounted into the cartridge as into the machine. And what happens is that the NES will take some data into itself, just some number, right? It doesn't matter what it is. And then it will start transforming it. And let's say, for the sake of argument, it's nowhere near as simple as that. But what the NES does is it takes whatever number and multiplies it by 2, right? So it'll take this number, multiply it by 2, and it'll send it, what's 572 times 2? Whatever that is, right? 1044, I think it is. Okay, you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. So it sends this and says, hey, I'm going to send you 572. What are you going to return me? And the cartridge says, oh, 572, I'm going to modify that number using my internal algorithm, and I'm going to send you back the result. and it sends back the result, which is exactly 572 times 2, right? So now this chip is going to say, okay, when I took the 572 and did my internal logic on it, I got 1044. What did the cartridge get? Oh, it got the same number? Cool, I trust this guy, right? So you're not storing a key, a password, you're storing a way of modifying data in the chip so that regardless of what number I give, I will always know what to expect back from the cartridge, right? It's almost like saying to a friend, okay, our secret password is going to be, whenever I give you a number, in your head you're going to multiply it by 2, right? So whenever I give you a number, you're going to multiply it by 2. So I go to my friend and I say, hey Bob, 57. And Bob comes back and says, oh, 114. So now I think, what has Bob done with this number? I expected him to return me 57 times 2. And he gave me back 114, which is 57 times 2. Cool. We have a secret shared. And so that's kind of how it worked, right? Now, how did they pick this initial number? Because you don't want this number to be the same every time. Because the minute that the person who is trying to fake your cartridge guesses what the number is, then that's it, game's over. So inside the NES, like every electronic device, at some point there's going to be some electrical noise, some random kind of, white noise, staticky kind of stuff. And there is a particular capacitor on the NES that is noisy. They just took the input from that and fed it in here. So the person who's trying to make the fake cartridge doesn't know what number is going to come. It seems to be a different number every single time. But the Nintendo knows, regardless of what number it is, I know what I should be receiving from this chip, which is identical to me. And if I don't get that, then I'm going to lock out. What does the lockout actually do? What does this chip actually do if the numbers don't match? What it does is essentially it holds down the reset button on your Nintendo. So you'll notice if you have a cart which has a bad DRM chip, or if your Nintendo, heaven forbid, has a bad DRM chip in it, the screen is just purple. That is the same thing that happens if you just press and hold the reset button. And that prevents the game from running, right? So this is how essentially the Nintendo establishes that it is a licensed chip. They control the production of these chips, and the algorithm is unknown to them. And in fact, I think to this day, nobody actually knows what that algorithm is. Like, it's managed to survive. So I will sell you this chip if you're an official licensed game maker. You put in your cartridge, and that means that whenever I send you a number, I will be able to predict what number comes back. Everything's cool. If you give me back something else, sorry, dude, I'm constantly resetting your machine until you pull this card. And that's how the DRM works. Okay, so that's how you do DRM on these chips. Now, unfortunately, there is a downside to it. The design is actually very nice, and there were actually comparatively few bootleg games made for the NES. There were some ways to get around. Of course, no security technology is impregnable. If you have something that's valuable enough and you put a security system on it, people are going to try and defeat that, right? No one's trying to crack my PIN code on my bank because I don't have any money in it, but I'm pretty sure people are going after Bill Gates' bank account all the time, right? So the chip does have some problems because you basically flow in this this kind of special number, and then you have to get back the exact number out again. If there was any kind of noise in the circuit which could be caused by a poor connection, or maybe some interference from like your fridge which was next to your across the wall from your computer or something, and the number that came back wasn't exactly the right number, then the lockout chip would freak out and say, oh, the numbers don't match, and then the game would stop working. And as these kind of machines get older, you find that more and more, right? So if you go to your retro video game store and you buy an NES cartridge, sometimes you will, even though it's like a completely legit cartridge, you will have the purple screen of death, right? So there is a way you can solve that problem. You can very easily mod a NES to turn off this feature. Because what the NES does is this DRM mechanism runs kind of alongside the CPU, right? So the CPU doesn't wait for the DRM to come back and give it a thumbs up and say, yeah, you can run this game. It runs completely independently, and if it sees that, hey, it's not a bona fide cartridge, I'm just going to hit reset and block you from playing it. So you can actually simply turn off the DRM chip on the NES, and then the check will not happen, and so you get rid of those problems. And the way you do it is you basically cut off the leg on this DRM chip that supplies plus 5 volts. If there's no electricity flowing into it, the circuit's not running, it doesn't do the check, and you're done. But you got to do that not on the cartridge, you got to do it on the NES side. So, like serious collectors will never do that because, of course, you're kind of, breaking the machine. But if you are serious about playing games on your NES, and you're a serious collector, you should have your serious collection NES, which you don't touch and will run only half your games, and then the one that you actually play with, which you will pop the leg off on the chip. And that's very simple mod. There's lots of places online when you can read how to do that. So that's kind of the prototypical, this is Cybernoid, but really, bulk of NES games look the same. Program ROM, character ROM, lockout chip, DRM, and then your memory management chip. Let's look at a special kind of cartridge though, and this one I'm going to be quite careful with because it's one that I really enjoy, and that is a cartridge like this, right? Dragon Warrior. So why is Dragon Warrior special? Dragon Warrior is special because it allows you to save your game, right? As you can imagine, once Nintendo started making bank switching really easy, and games started having more and more content, eventually you're going to get to a point where you have this game which takes many hours to finish, right? You can't, I mean, if a game takes more than about 8 or 9 hours to finish, you can't expect someone to do that in a single sitting. So if you're going to have a long game, you have to have a way to preserve the state of what the player is doing, their inventory, their position in the game, how many lives they have, experience points, whatever. You have to be able to save that somehow, so that when they turn off the machine, go back to bed, and then come back the next day, everything comes back, right? Now, you'll recall that the NES doesn't have a hard drive inside. It doesn't have any kind of flash memory or SD drives. All that stuff didn't exist or was prohibitively expensive. So how do you save your game? How do I know that when I come back tomorrow, I'm still going to have, you know, my magical +1 sword and my experience points and everything? The answer to that is you save the game inside the cartridge itself, right? Later systems like PlayStation or even the N64 had memory, kind of non-volatile memory in the console itself, right? The memory cards and memory packs that would save it. But the NES wasn't designed from that because I guess when they designed it, they didn't expect people to write these multi-hour games that you can finish in one sitting. So if it's not on the machine, you got to put it on the cartridge because those are your only two options, right? So let's pop this guy open carefully because I really like this game. So let's pop this guy open carefully and see how they did that. So one thing that you notice is the back looks a little different. If you have one of these, oh, which way do I go? If you have one of these games, you'll notice they have instructions there saying, don't yank it out without powering off because it'll kill your save state. When you power off, you must hold down the reset line, which is because of the way the save is implemented and so on. So let's open this up and see what it looks like. It's got the same kind of screws. Let's pop those off. The body is exactly the same, right? It is the same plastic mold, the same shade gray plastic. And actually, the interesting thing about this game is when Nintendo moved the NES from Japan to the US, this kind of very long RPG type game, which takes many hours to finish, and you have to kind of, you know, really commit a lot to. The prediction in Japan and from the NES so from the Nintendo executives was that this is the kind of game that will never do well in the US. And the reason they believed that was because arcade games were very popular in the US, and Atari games, Atari 2600 games were very popular. And those were like beer and pretzel games, right? You kind of sit there, you play them for a couple hours, and you get bored, you bring in the next game and so on. So they thought, yeah, American audiences are not going to be interested in this kind of long slog game, right? And I mean, if you consider how popular RPGs are now everywhere, like I guess they missed that. So it actually, games like Zelda and Dragon Warrior took a long time to come to the US because they were, even though there were people in Nintendo who said, no, these games are going to sell, we should translate them and take them over to the US, there was a lot of resistance internally to doing that. So anyway, let's pop this guy open and see what he looks like. Okay, pops open nice and easy. So from the back, it doesn't look very different, but let's do a little size comparison. Whoa, look at that. I mean, that board on the Dragon Warrior is much bigger. It's got this whole chunk over here, and it's got these little capacitors that are kind of popping up. So we can already see that something interesting is going on here. So let's lift this guy up and see what we have. Okay, there we go. Look at that. Very different. Very different. So what we have here, let me bring it a little closer so you can see, is of course the first thing you notice is a watch battery. This is a standard watch battery. You can't really change this battery without opening your cartridge. So Nintendo had no plans to allow anybody to change these batteries because of course they use security screws in their cartridges, right? It's not like they expect someone to have that screwdriver. But in many senses, it's very similar to a Cybernoid cartridge. Here is your DRM lockout chip, right? This is your memory manager over here. And then you've got CHR-ROM, PRG-ROM, and then this new thing, which we haven't seen before, right? What is that? And then some little small kind of jelly bean parts here, circuitry. So this is what's going on in this cartridge. In terms of the main game itself, it works just like Cybernoid. you've got your code here plus sounds. This contains your graphical data, and in Dragon Warrior there's quite a lot of this stuff. This is your DRM lockout chip, and this is the memory manager. The memory manager here, however, I don't know if you'll be able to see the code on it. Which way do I need to move? There we go. This is actually not using a Philips part like Nintendo did. This is actually a Nintendo branded part, and the code is Nintendo MMC1B2. It's one of the several standard memory controller models that Nintendo made available. So Japanese games would often use these. Games that came from the US or Europe would often use something like a Philips part, right? Just because developers in either side of the Pacific were used to one kind of technology or the other. So what's going on here is this chip, this mysterious new chip, which is actually branded sharp, so again, Japanese part, right? There is one thing that is very cool about Japanese designs is they are very keen on supporting their own industry. So Japanese gamers love Japanese games and technology. Japanese companies prefer to trade with each other. There's a real community around it, which is very nice. And of course, in the 1980s, the early 80s when this game would have been made, Japan had absolutely the complete cutting edge of electronics and semiconductor technology, right? Like the manufacturing was way more reliable. They had far fewer errors in their parts. The production was cheaper. So Japanese electronic consumer goods were just fantastic compared to everything else. And that's another huge advantage that Nintendo had in the US. So anyway, what does this sharp piece do? What this is a volatile RAM. So this, unlike these chips which are read-only, you can read and write to this one, right? So some of these pins up here are actually going to let you write state back to this chip. And this is kind of the hard drive of this cartridge. This is where you store your experience points, where you are in the game, etc. That's your save file, essentially. Now, why do we need a battery? The reason we need a battery is today, if you were going to do this, you would use something called flash RAM, which is the same thing that exists in your SD card or your USB drive or any of that kind of stuff. And the thing about flash RAM is you plug it into your machine and it needs plus 5 volts in order to write to it. But when you cut the current to it, when you remove the electricity, it keeps the stuff stored. And that's because flash memory is a relatively new, meaning long after the 80s technology. When Nintendo was designing these games, they didn't have flash memory. This chip requires constant electricity feed for it to not forget what it's storing. And that's what the battery does, right? The battery provides you the constant electrical feed to keep the memory going. Which means, if this battery ever runs out, boom, there goes your save game, right? So this is kind of a ticking time bomb in a sense, because one day, this battery will run out of juice, and then your save game will disappear, right? Now, that sounds like a pretty crappy user experience, Nintendo. How come you didn't let me change the battery? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, if you wanted to change this battery, you have to first remove it and then put the new one in, right? When you removed it, boom, you would lose your save game. So you would have to design somehow a mechanism that lets you switch out the battery without losing state, which would be, you know, expensive to do. And secondly, Nintendo did the maths on this one and figured, okay, how much current, how much electricity does this actually eat? It's some amount. How much does this give out, and how long will it be able to sustain this? And they did the maths and figured, okay, this kind of battery is going to keep this going for, you know, whatever it might be, 10, 15, 20 years. That's cool. Nobody's going to want to play this game in 20 years' time, right? They'll be playing Nintendo Wii by that stage. Everybody's going to play Nintendo Wii. It'll be the amazing thing. So they figured, okay, yeah, you'll lose your save game, but in 20 years' time, are you really going to care about Dragon Warrior anymore? And this is the kind of engineering trade-off that you have to make, right? In order to allow every single scenario for every single user, this cartridge would be really complex and really expensive. So you have to make a kind of educated guess. This thing has a lifetime. At some point, nobody's going to care. I mean, yeah, you know, us who are retro gamers care about them, but what are we? Like a tiny percentage of the people who actually bought this thing back in the day. So of the bulk of your users, what is the lifespan of this cartridge? That's what the battery has to support. Let's not worry about dealing with every single case, right? That's the kind of trade-off that engineers need to make all the time. So that's it. That is how some games allow you to save, some Nintendo games, and then some Nintendo games don't. And also how Nintendo managed to essentially cheat the limits of the address bus by having bank switching and letting you have these giant games, and also ensure that people didn't release crappy games. Although, of course, you know, people got around that eventually. So I hope you enjoyed that. We'll see you soon for another episode. Take care.